Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal moments in modern history, but with a twist. We're asking, what if the largest amphibious invasion in history had failed? What if the beaches of Normandy became a graveyard for Allied hopes, and the Western powers lost their chance to liberate Europe? This isn't just about a single battle. This is about how one catastrophic failure could have reshaped the entire 20th century and the world we live in today. Before we begin, if you enjoy alternate history content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. Alright, let's set the stage. By early 1944, the Second World War had been raging for nearly 5 years. Europe was under the control of the German regime and its allies. The Eastern Front was a brutal meat grinder where Soviet forces were slowly pushing back the German military, but at an unimaginable cost in human lives. Meanwhile, the Western Allies, primarily the United States, Britain, and Canada, had been fighting in North Africa and Italy, but they hadn't opened a major front in Western Europe. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, repeatedly demanded that the Western Allies create a second front to relieve pressure on his forces. The answer to that demand was Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Normandy, France, scheduled for June 6, 1944. This operation, commonly known as DDay, would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Over 150,000 troops would storm 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of the French coast: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Success meant the beginning of the end for the German regime in Western Europe. Failure? Well, that's what we're here to explore. In reality, D-Day succeeded, though at a terrible cost. Thousands of soldiers died on those beaches, particularly at Omaha Beach where American forces faced withering fire from heavily fortified German positions. But the Allies gained their foothold, and within months, Paris was liberated. By May 1945, the war in Europe was over. But what if things had gone differently? Let's imagine the worst-case scenario. Let's say that on June 6, 1944, everything that could go wrong does go wrong. First, the weather. In our timeline, the invasion was nearly postponed because of terrible weather conditions. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made the gutsy call to proceed during a brief window of slightly better weather. But what if that window never opened? What if the storm continued, scattering the naval fleet and drowning paratroopers before they even reached land? Second, intelligence failure. The Allies had successfully fooled the German high command into believing the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. But what if the deception failed? What if the German leader and his generals saw through the ruse and reinforced Normandy with additional armored divisions days before the invasion? Third, tactical disaster. At Omaha Beach, American forces nearly failed to secure their position. If German reinforcements had arrived just a few hours earlier, or if more defensive positions had been operational, the beach could have become an impassable killing zone. Now, combine all 3 factors. The weather is worse, the Germans are prepared, and the initial waves of troops are cut down before they can establish any beachhead. By nightfall on June 6, instead of a tenuous Allied foothold, we have tens of thousands of casualties, destroyed equipment littering the beaches, and a complete military catastrophe. The Allied commanders, looking at the carnage, make the painful decision to withdraw. D-Day has failed. News of the disaster spreads quickly. In London, Washington, and Moscow, leaders face a grim reality. The Western Allies have just suffered one of the worst military defeats in modern history. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, faces intense pressure. His political enemies demand his resignation. The British public, already weary from years of war, begins to question whether victory is even possible. In the United States, President Franklin Roosevelt faces similar criticism. American mothers ask why their sons died on a French beach for nothing. The alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union begins to crack. Stalin, already suspicious of his capitalist allies, openly accuses them of intentionally delaying the Second Front. He suggests they wanted Soviet forces to bleed while preserving their own strength. Trust between East and West deteriorates rapidly. In Berlin, the German leader and his inner circle celebrate. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels proclaims it as proof of Axis invincibility. The German regime had been on the defensive for months, but this victory provides a massive morale boost. The German leader orders his generals to redouble fortifications along the entire Atlantic Wall. More ominously, resources that would have been diverted to defending against the Allied advance can now be redirected. Some go to the Eastern Front to counter the Soviets. Others go toward secret weapons programs, advanced rockets, jet aircraft, and perhaps even more sinister projects. With no second front to worry about, the German military can concentrate more forces against the Soviet Union. The Red Army's advance slows. Battles that would have been victories become stalemates. The siege of cities becomes even more brutal. The human cost rises even higher than in our timeline, and it was already catastrophic. For the people living under Axis occupation, the failed invasion is devastating. Resistance movements had risen up to support the Allied invasion, believing liberation was at hand. Now, they face brutal reprisals. The secret police and military units sweep through France, executing suspected partisans and their families. The dark events targeting persecuted communities intensify, as the German regime feels emboldened and less worried about accountability. Without D-Day's success, the war in Europe doesn't end in May 1945. Instead, it grinds on, becoming even more brutal and destructive. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway remain under Axis control. The populations endure at least another year, possibly two, of occupation, forced labor, food shortages, and oppression. Hundreds of thousands more civilians die from starvation, disease, and wartime atrocities. In our timeline, the success of D-Day meant that German forces in Italy were stretched thin. In this alternate timeline, with no Western front to worry about, the German military can reinforce Italy. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula slows to a crawl. Cities like Florence and Venice see more destruction. The campaign becomes another bloody stalemate. Make no mistake, the Soviet Union would continue fighting. Stalin was committed to destroying the German regime, regardless of what the Western Allies did. Soviet forces would still push westward, liberating Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and eventually Germany itself. But without the pressure of a Western front, this advance is slower and far bloodier. Every city, every river crossing, every mile costs thousands more lives. The final battles for Berlin and other German cities are even more apocalyptic than in our timeline. By the time Soviet forces reach the Rhine River in late 1945 or early 1946, Europe is even more devastated. The death toll is millions higher. Entire cities are reduced to rubble. One of the most terrifying possibilities is what happens with advanced weapons development. In our timeline, the German regime was working on jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and potentially even an atomic weapon program. Allied bombing and the rapid advance of Allied forces disrupted these programs. In this timeline, with more time and resources, could the German regime have deployed more advanced jets in larger numbers? Could they have perfected their long-range rockets and used them to devastating effect on London or Moscow? The atomic question is particularly chilling. In reality, the German regime's nuclear program was far behind the Manhattan Project. But with an extra year or two, and with resources not diverted to defending France, could they have made progress? Even if they didn't build a functioning weapon, the fear alone could have changed Allied strategy. Meanwhile, the Manhattan Project continues in the United States. By July 1945, the first atomic test succeeds in New Mexico. The question then becomes, where do the Americans use these superweapons? It's worth noting that the war against Japan continues largely as in our timeline. American forces island hop across the Pacific. But with the European war still raging, there's pressure to end the Pacific conflict quickly. The atomic devices are still used, probably on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, forcing Japan's surrender. But with Europe still at war, American resources and attention remain divided. Eventually, the German regime falls. But the end comes differently, and the aftermath is far darker. The most likely scenario is that Soviet forces capture Berlin sometime in late 1945 or early 1946. The German leader, seeing his regime crumbling, still ends his life in his underground shelter. The European war officially ends, but the cost has been staggering. An alternative possibility, faced with total defeat and potentially fearing capture, the German leadership might try to negotiate a conditional surrender. They might offer to surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets, hoping for better treatment. Whether the Allies accept such an offer, and whether Stalin would tolerate it, becomes a major source of tension. In our timeline, World War II killed approximately 70 to 85 million people. In this alternate timeline, with the war lasting an extra year or more, and with the fighting in Europe being even more intense, we could be looking at 90 to 100 million deaths or more. The dark events targeting persecuted communities continue longer. Detention camps operate for an additional year. The genocide's death toll rises even higher than the already incomprehensible 6 million of our timeline. Soviet casualties, already the highest of any nation in the war, increase by millions. Civilian deaths across Europe skyrocket due to continued fighting, bombing, starvation, and disease. When the war finally ends, Europe is even more devastated than in our timeline. Cities from Paris to Warsaw lie in ruins. Infrastructure is destroyed. Millions are displaced, homeless, and starving. The refugee crisis is even more overwhelming. The failure of D-Day doesn't just change World War II, it fundamentally alters the post-war order and sets the stage for a very different Cold War. This is the most significant change. In our timeline, American and British forces liberated France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany. In this alternate timeline, Soviet forces do almost all the heavy lifting in defeating the German regime. What does that mean? It means that when the fighting stops, the Red Army occupies far more of Europe. Instead of meeting American forces at the Elbe River in central Germany, Soviet troops might reach the Rhine or even the French border. Stalin, having sacrificed even more Soviet lives to defeat the Axis, feels entitled to shape Europe's future. Countries like France, which in our timeline remained independent and democratic, might fall under Soviet influence or even become communist states. Western Germany, instead of becoming a democratic ally of the United States, might be entirely absorbed into the Soviet sphere. The Iron Curtain doesn't fall across Central Europe, it falls much farther west, perhaps along the Rhine River or even the French-German border. The United States and Britain, having failed at D-Day and contributed less to the final victory, have far less influence in post-war negotiations. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences, where the Allies divided up Europe, play out very differently. Stalin has far more leverage and uses it. American prestige is damaged. The United States is still a nuclear power and economic giant, but its military reputation has taken a serious hit. Europe sees America as the power that failed when it mattered most. Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, becomes even more of a secondary power. The British Empire's decline accelerates. With the Soviet Union controlling far more of Europe, the Cold War becomes even more tense. NATO, if it forms at all, is a much smaller alliance defending a much smaller free Europe. The dividing line between East and West is farther west, meaning cities like Paris or Amsterdam could be on the front lines of any future conflict. The nuclear arms race is even more intense, because both sides feel more threatened. Proxy wars might be even more numerous and bloody. In our timeline, the Marshall Plan helped rebuild Western Europe, creating prosperous democracies and strong American allies. In this timeline, there's much less of Western Europe to rebuild. American aid goes to a smaller number of countries, and the recovery is slower and more difficult. The failure of D-Day and the extended European war might actually affect the Chinese Civil War and the Korean War. With America more distracted and less confident, Soviet influence in Asia grows stronger. Communist movements in Asia might receive more support. The Cold War in Asia could be even more intense, with larger conflicts erupting earlier. So, what if D-Day had failed? The answer is sobering. The war would have lasted longer, killed more people, and ended with Soviet forces occupying far more of Europe. The post-war world would have been darker, with communism spreading farther west and democracy controlling less of the globe. This alternate history reminds us just how pivotal certain moments truly are. The brave soldiers who stormed those beaches on June 6, 1944, didn't just fight for victory in that battle, they fought for the shape of the entire post-war world. Their success, bought with thousands of lives, made possible the free, democratic Western Europe we know today. History is fragile. Outcomes that seem inevitable often hang on the thinnest threads: weather conditions, intelligence reports, individual decisions made under unimaginable pressure. D-Day succeeded, but it so easily could have failed. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think would have happened if the invasion had failed? Do you agree with this analysis, or do you see things playing out differently? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into alternate history, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more content like this. Until next time, remember, history is written by what happened, but it's understood by exploring what might have been.